Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Signal or Noise. This is episode 38. I'm Charlie Bilello. With me, as always, Peter Mallouk. Peter, I'm going to go right to the docket because we got a lot going on. Just two topics here, but that's going to cover a lot within there. The election, of course, and what comes next. That's what everyone's asking. So we're going to go through all of the major issues here, try to break them down, talk about the possibilities or probabilities of different things happening. And then we'll end, as we always do, with Signal or Noise, some relatively big moves in the markets following the election so far. But as we know, that could change, of course, as time goes on. But so we'll dig into that as well. Okay. Without further ado, the election and what comes next. First, I want to run through what actually happened. So President Trump reelected here, 312 electoral votes. He actually won all of the swing states in terms of the seven swing states that people were wondering which way they would go. They all went to Trump. The Senate, GOP taking control of the Senate, so taking that back from the Democrats. In the House, we don't have official results here, but the projection is they're likely to keep the House as well, which I think a lot of people going into it thought might flip to the Democrats. So what's interesting once again here, Peter, is that the polls got it wrong here. You can see before the election, they were leaning, depending on what you were looking at, a few points in favor of Harris. And pretty much every swing state ended up voting more for Trump than what the polls predicted going in. And who ended up getting it right? Betting markets on the whole got the presidential part right. I think they were about 55% leaning towards Trump heading into the election. So certainly better than the polls. What they didn't get right, though, was the popular vote, which was, I think, 75-25 in favor of Harris. And the Republicans looks like they're going to take the popular vote there. And they had a pretty low probability of the Republican sweep in terms of, I think it was around 40% the morning of the election, and that's what actually occurred. So before we dig into some of the issues and stuff, what do you make of the election? Were you surprised by the results? And what do you think about, are we ever going to trust these polls again after they keep on getting it wrong time after time here?
Well, one thing I thought was interesting is there was a guy that bet tens of millions of dollars on Trump to win, and they asked him, "Well, how did you, make the decision, when you looked at the polls?" And he said he saw a poll, and the poll basically asked people how they were going to vote, and it had Harris winning, but the same polling company said, "Who do you think your neighbor is going to vote for?" And it had Trump winning, and that gave him the confidence that enough Trump supporters were not vocalizing that they would vote for Trump to bet the largest bet, I think, in presidential campaign history on Trump. Which is a fascinating story. But to answer
Yeah,
your question,
I heard that guy. He also bet on the popular vote for the Republicans, which was even
that's
more
crazy. Yeah, I
favorable.
mean, who would have
Yeah,
thought? Yeah. So
yeah.
I think that I I feel a little sympathy for the pollsters. I mean, everyone's talking like this election was like 60-40 or something like that. This is, I think, as the time we're talking, a 1 point something percent difference in popular vote, and the swing states went by a couple points. Yeah, the polling's off a little bit, but it's not like, to me, it's not as dramatic as appears to be. But obviously, there is an effect. I don't know it's unique to Republicans. I think it's unique to Trump that he is persistently underrepresented in presidential elections in the polls. So I think no one's going to believe, any of these polls, put as much credence on them, although we won't have another election with Trump. So it'll be interesting in the future how they play out. But I feel some sympathy. I feel some sympathy for the pollsters.
It's very hard to reach everyone. I still haven't met anyone who's ever answered a poll, so that to me immediately is kind of a red flag. How do I trust something when I don't know anyone who's actually answered this thing? But certainly it gives credence to betting markets when people putting money on the line, whatever information they have or data crunching is probably, and this doesn't always work out, by the way, right? As we can see here with the probability of a sweep and the overall popular vote, they didn't get it right. But in terms of, if you're going to pick one of the two, I'm going to pick one where people are actually putting money on the line
Well, yeah, you're
versus
always going to pick
trying to buy.
it's just kind of like show me what you're doing, not what you're saying, and put your money where your mouth is type thing. That plays out not just with presidential elections, but with investing and everything else.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So we got a lot of topics here, Peter. You and I are going to try to run through all of these if possible. I know we're getting a lot of questions from clients on all of these different topics,
Yeah.
and some people are concerned. I think, regardless of who won, there was going to be concern on the other side, right? That there's going to be policies enacted that people don't agree with. Perhaps it's going to be bad. This happens. This is nothing unique to this election. It happened 4 years ago. It happened 4 years before that. In 4 years, there's always going to be issues that people are concerned about. And it's very hard to say exactly what's going to happen. So we know that the Republicans have the power to pass legislation now. So it's more likely they're going to do something, but exactly what they focus on still remains to be seen. So just be careful assuming that everything that they talked about on the campaign trail is actually going to go through. So we're going to go through taxes, government spending and deficits, the economy, inflation, immigration, deregulation, energy policy, tariffs, foreign policy, and wars, and Federal Reserve. Peter, does that about cover everything?
Let's do it. Let's dive in.
Okay,
A lot
let's
of
start with
ground.
taxes here. I think this probably is the easiest one, and if you go based on history, that's what kind of they led with the last time around when they had full control after Trump was elected the first time. So it seems very likely that at least some of these things are going to happen. What's your take? What do you think is the highest probability in terms of these proposed? I just summarized here some of the proposed ideas that went on during the campaign.
Okay, so I've done. There are two calls that stick out in my career around elections. So first, when President Obama won, I remember where I was when I was talking a client into staying invested. I did not succeed. That client lost a huge amount of money by not being invested during the Obama administration. And I took a similar call when Trump won the first time, and that person lost a huge amount of money. So just before we get into taxes, the markets are going to find a way. I didn't see that in our list of topics today. The markets just do not
I have
care.
that at the end. I
Yeah,
have
I
that at
mean,
the
come
end.
on. All right, so we'll come to that. All right,
Yes.
but let's talk big picture taxes because there's a lot of proposals. You've listed them out here,
Yep.
but let's talk about the big picture taxes.
Yeah.
And this is going to surprise people. Under Bush, under Obama, so we're talking about 16 years now between those two, under Trump, under Biden, across all of them, income tax rates moved less than 3%, right? So the impact on income taxes of all the campaign promises across all the Democrats and Republicans across income taxes, talking about almost no movement whatsoever, no change in anybody's life around income taxes for all the talk from both parties. Let's talk about the next biggest tax, which is capital gains tax. The main tax people pay is income. The
Yep.
second one they pay is capital gains. You sell a stock, you sell a business, you sell property. It's gone up in price. When you sell it, the gain is taxed at a different rate. It's called the capital gains tax. Under Bush, under Obama, under Biden, under previous Trump administration, the capital gains tax has not moved at all. It stayed exactly the same. No one paid more, no one paid less. These are the two biggest taxes that exist. So all this stuff that Trump and Harris were talking about, this is all on the periphery. I'm not saying it's meaningless. I'm saying this idea that the world has completely changed tax wise. It's just not true. All the conversation around both parties all the time, you don't really see the radical change that people expect to see. So when we look at the proposals that Trump made. And what's interesting is the proposals across both parties were very similar, like these things like not taxing tips and so on. A lot of these main policies were very similar. The difference between the two parties and the tax proposals is a rounding error. So when I look at what some of the things that Trump is proposing about lowering the corporate tax rate, I think, or not taxing tips or deduction for auto loan interest or raising the child tax credit, which we heard Vance talk about, raising that credit to $5,000. I think
Yep.
there's a high probability these things are going to happen. And I think they will be offset probably somewhere else. And I think for the majority of our listeners, the impact is going to be not significant. Now, the corporate income tax going from 21% to 15 is not directly significant to people. It will impact stock prices. Obviously, corporations that pay 6% less in taxes, you have 6% more in profits. But I would not be surprised if they make up for this somewhere else, right? With a change in a capital gains rate or something else where this becomes a little more neutral. So look, I am not overly like. There's a lot of things. These candidates were extremely different on social issues. They're extremely different on other issues, and they're a little bit different on economic issues, but not as radically different, I think, as most people think. What's your take, Charlie, on where this goes with all these proposals?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think the it takes away kind of that uncertainty of removing because we had that expiration, right, of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So a lot of people were asking, in terms of all the changes that were made back then. As you said, it wasn't huge in terms of the actual tax rate, but we did have that big bump up in the standard deduction, an increase in the child tax credit, which likely would have stayed either way. The estate taxes, right? Potentially that could have rolled back. So there's a lot of things here that clients were uncertain about, and now we're kind of certain at least all of that stuff will remain. And then the
Yeah, I think just
question
to
moves,
just to clarify,
yeah,
just for those that aren't, like, on top of the tax
sh-
code,
sure,
under the Bush administration, decades ago, there were rules put in place that were going to expire. And there was a question of when they expired, would a Democrat or Republican, uh, you know, revert them back? So, in other words, the taxes we're paying today, some of them, like the estate tax, were set to go up at the end of next year. And I think with the Republicans in charge of the Senate and the presidential seat, they'll just say they're not going to expire. So, yeah, to your
yep.
point, at least that uncertainty is gone. There was a big question. I mean, we saw even under Democrat leadership, they didn't attempt to overturn this law, right? So it looks like it may have stayed in place anyway, but we definitely have no uncertainty now, or very close to no uncertainty.
Yes, they didn't do it. They talked about doing it, in a number of different ways. They didn't
Mm,
have the votes essentially to do it, which just shows you, none of this thing is permanent. The whole idea of permanent is kind of laughable because,
right,
of course, anytime Congress wants to change it, they can change it. So none of that. But at least that's taken off the table. People have some certainty for at least 2 more years, or at least 4 more years, most likely. So even if the Republicans lose the House or the Senate 2 years from now, Trump isn't going to sign higher taxes likely into law. The $10,000 cap, it's a big issue for people in New York, California. We'll see how that plays out because there's going to be Republican senators and congressmen in these other red states that like that cap and that might not want to vote for it. I don't know. I think that's more of a bipartisan thing because you see constituents where I am in New York. You see even Democrats within New York Congress pushing for it and senators because they see that's what the people want. So I'm not sure. We'll see how that goes. As you said, the corporate tax rate. Maybe that's why the stock market was running up this year ahead of that. Maybe they think it's going to get pushed through. We saw a similar stock market rally in 2017 ahead of that cut. But it's not clear exactly what that will mean because the way Trump has talked about it is only for domestic production, only if you're going to produce that stuff within America. So you're not going to get that benefit if you don't
right.
do that. So that's very complex how they could, parse that out. I'm not sure at the end of the day what will happen with that. The most bipartisan thing, Peter, would be a thing that I actually don't even agree with. And we had talked about it previously, which would be this idea of exempting tips and Social
Right.
Security and overtime pay from
Yeah.
taxes. Because to me, that's picking and choosing who shouldn't pay taxes and why shouldn't everybody get that benefit. Why only if you work in a job that gets tips, or why only people who are receiving Social Security benefits or people who work overtime? Why only those people should not pay that tax?
Yeah, I mean,
That makes absolutely no sense to me.
this to me, this proposal by the Trump administration immediately followed by Harris. Like, both of them had the same proposal on
Yes.
exempting tips. Let's just pick this one out. Uh,
Yeah.
this is an incredibly unfair one, right? So you have someone who's working at, say, Sonic, or let's take Wendy's. You're at Wendy's, you don't get any
Yeah.
tips. Let's say you're making $18 an hour at Wendy's. Under the Trump proposal and what Harris matched, that person making $18 an hour is going to pay taxes. Instead, you're working at like a drive-in type place like Sonic. Meal costs the same, but someone's sitting in their car. Sonic pays their people a little bit less because they get tips. So the person working at Sonic doesn't pay taxes on their tip. The person working at Wendy's does pay taxes. This is unfair. Just lower all of their taxes and be done with it and be fair about it. So to me, this was a campaign gimmick. Both parties had it. I don't see how they implement. I mean, I guess there's been a lot of unfair things passed historically under Republicans, Democrat. Maybe they're going to pass it, but what you'll wind up having is maybe a change in the way business. A lot of people will pay people less, encourage tipping, and or classify part of compensation as tip. There's going to be a lot of stuff, games that will be played if this kind of thing passes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we'll see what happens on taxes. I think at least some of this stuff will go through, but the biggest thing of all is just that that prior law is not going to reset, right? And so
Right.
people have some certainty surrounding that. And the other stuff is just going to be bargaining, going back and forth. And the big question, I think, on taxes is going to be related to the spending and deficits, because there are going to be certain people within the Republican Party who are concerned about the deficit and this idea of cutting taxes again, like we did back then. So we did those big tax cuts back in 2017, but there was no reduction in spending. So what we saw, Peter, as you know, is the deficit started to rise. That was before COVID. It was going up, right? It was getting close to $1 trillion. I think it even surpassed $1 trillion just before COVID. And then, of course, it ballooned higher. And here we are today with a deficit of around $2 trillion, and likely to rise, as we talked about, under either party unless they can do something about government spending. So the big question, Peter, of course, is, well, where does it come from, right? Trump has already said many times, and I think you could probably take his word on this, he's not going to touch Social Security. He's not going to touch Medicare. People love those programs, so it has to come from somewhere else. So there's this Department of Government Efficiency that's supposedly going to be created. Elon Musk is going to run that, and he's talking
Uh,
about waste, fraud, and abuse. And I know we talked about it on the last episode, but do you think he can do anything about this enormous amount of spending that has just seen an enormous increase? And it wasn't just, okay, we bumped it up during 2020, during COVID. We had to do it because the economy was going to depression. We kept on spending after that as if we're still in a crisis. So where's he going to take it from? Is he going to be able to cut anything? To me, it would be a miracle, Peter, just given the trajectory over the both Trump and Biden, just given the trajectory. It would be a miracle if they just held the line on spending. If they went 0% increase for a year, that would have
right.
been absolute. This idea of cutting $2 trillion, to me, I don't see it at all possible. I'm hopeful they could cut something, but even zero would be a win in my view.
I think what you'll see is so much of the deficit is the built-in increases for all these departments, and I think you can make a lot of progress just by saying there's a freeze. I think they're going to go beyond that, and I think we're going to see a lot of these departments see severe cuts, and part of it's philosophical, right? Like
Yeah,
Democrats want there to be more federal power, and Republicans want there to be more state power. It's just a philosophical way of looking at things. So philosophically, you don't care as much about the as a conservative about the Department of Education because you believe it should be handled at the state level anyway. So this is an
that's one they've
expense.
talked about, right?
Yeah,
Potentially eliminate. I don't see that happening, but that's 300 billion right there, right? You
right.
could cut
So
something.
yeah, I think what we're going to see is, hey, your increases aren't 4% a year; they're 2%, or they're 0% for a while, and certain departments we're going to cut severely. But I mean, I just can't see him going after Social Security and Medicare because he's promised on the record multiple times not to do it.
Yeah,
Vance has promised on the record not to do it. He's
that's
been
right.
accused of that he will do it because it's the only way to accomplish the things he said he was going to accomplish, and because his voter base, the very
Yeah.
heavily is in that group, and so I just think that's just going to be
And he was
uh,
president for 4 years, and he didn't
and
touch
didn't
it and
touch
didn't
it.
talk
Yeah,
about it.
that's right.
We know it's the third
Yeah,
rail
neither
of
party's
politics.
touching that. Yeah.
They're not good. They're not good. So they'll have to. So I like the idea. I'm hopeful. I don't know how Elon Musk has any time for it, but if you were to go in there and look at and say, this is glaringly waste, this is fraud, 100. Like who's not in favor of eliminating fraud? That's it.
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of very interesting things because I mean, it's very clear. Every now and then, under both administrations, we get to see like the ridiculous spending
Yeah.
that happens inside of these
Right.
groups and
But
how
right,
bloated they
the
become.
idea that some people are suggesting that he can go in like he did with Twitter and cut 80%, and I have no doubt some of these departments could be cut and we would be just fine. But the politics of that and is very, very difficult, right? It's going to be a huge effort to cut anything, I think, from anywhere. So we'll
I
see.
will say I do think if we are going to see it, I think we're going to see it very early. So they're going to if they're going to do it, they're going to have to do it right away while they have some momentum. So I
Yep.
think we're going to see this unfold in early 2025 if it's going to happen at all.
Yeah, and hopefully, if there are additional tax cuts, they will tie it to spending cuts, and we'll keep that deficit in check. I mean, even at two trillion and rising, that's not in a good place, Peter. But
No.
if the idea of yeah, we could just keep cutting taxes without cutting spending, I think that's a dangerous position to have. So we'll see what happens there. Let's go to the economy here, Peter. And this is an interesting one because you tend to see a shift in power when there's a recession, right? Or people feel like there's job losses. That really wasn't the case this time. We've been in an expansion since 2020, right? The unemployment rate is still relatively low, 4.1%. We're not seeing massive layoffs. The big issue, it seems like, if you look at the exit polls, the big issue for most voters on the economy was the inflation side. So if we look at where inflation is, obviously it's come down, and they were kind of pointing to that as a win. And what the people were actually saying is what you and I have talked about. It's that cumulative inflation
Right.
that's been so punishing.
We've talked about this endlessly, and I feel like I've been talking about it for 2 years. And so I think that let's look at it in two parts. One is who's to blame for the inflation, right? Is it Biden? Is it post-COVID policy? It's the Federal Reserve. Let's call that irrelevant for our discussion today, right? It's not
Yep.
relevant. So,
Okay.
but when we look at the voter, what did the voter care about? The number one thing in the exit poll was this issue. To your point, so to me, the issue with this recovery is I like to call it a K-shaped recovery. The media calls it a V-shaped, right? You had COVID, everything went down, and then everything went up. But when we say everything, we mean stocks went up, and if you owned a business, the value went up. And if you owned a home, the value went up. If you owned real estate, you were renting to as apartment complex, or it went up. So if you owned assets, yes, they went down in value and then they went up a lot. And so you're like, hey, there was a recovery. I can feel it. I can see it. Most of our listeners can feel it and see it. Most creative planning clients can feel it and see it. But most Americans did not. And I think this is the big disconnect. Most Americans don't own a lot of stocks or no stocks. They don't own a business. They don't own rental real estate. Their home is not worth a lot, or they don't own a home. And their wages, we know this, their wages do not keep up with inflation. So for the average person working in America, they went to the grocery store and stuff cost a lot more. We could argue about whether it was 40% more or 60% more, but it's a lot more. Highest spike in inflation in decades, right? And their wages did not go up as much. So they are suffering. They just are. That's the reality of it. So it's a K shaped recovery. People who have money, great. Your assets went down, then they went up a lot, and you're probably richer than ever before. Everyone else, what you had went down and your income never recovered. So now the cost of everything is up and you don't have the money to spend on it. So yes, it is true what the Biden administration was saying, which is inflation is decelerating. In other words, yeah, it
Yep.
went up 40% or 50%. Everything costs 40 or 50% more, but now inflation isn't 8% a year anymore. It's only 3%. So it's back to normal. Well, the average American doesn't care, right? Everything still costs more than their earnings. And so they went to the ballot box, and the number one exit poll issue was, look, I need someone who can solve this. Now,
Yeah.
Harris is
So that's the
basically,
question, Peter. Tell me
yeah,
how they can solve it, and how much control
right.
does the president
Yeah.
or the House and
Yeah.
the Senate have on inflation?
Yeah, Harris was saying it's solved. It's back to 2 or 3%, and I'm going to continue to solve it. And Trump is saying it's a mess, and I'm going to fix it. And the reality
Yep.
of is neither of them had a lot of influence over this number, right? Because this has to do with how much money is in the system and the Federal Reserve policy. Yes, it was contributed to with all the stimulus and everything else that happened under the Trump administration, and then another wave of it that you can argue
Yeah.
is it necessary or not under the Biden administration. but most of this is around policy around the Federal Reserve. And I think, regardless of who was in office, how inflation is going to be for the next year would probably be about the same. Trump has proposed some things that are deflationary. Like, if you really let Elon Musk go in and he cuts the government in half, let's just say there was a world where that was going to happen. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
that's deflationary, right? There's a lot of people with less jobs.
Right.
There's a lot less people with those incomes and so on, and a
That's
lot
just,
of
you're
other,
essentially saying because that would cause economic growth to go down, and
in theory, right?
in
In
theory,
some,
yeah,
yeah, in some
the
theory,
immediate effect anyway of
the
that.
immediate
Yes.
effect. That's right. But he's also proposing, say, tariffs, which are inflationary, right? So he's got policies that are inflationary and deflationary. Th-
Yeah.
This very much has little to do with who's the president, but the average person walking in is just saying, like,
Yeah.
enough, I'll do whatever to just try to do something different. And I think there's just not enough. I think it's very hard for people that own assets to fully appreciate how hard it is for working class people in the United States right now. And if
So
you,
yeah, I 100% hear you
yeah,
and agree. And here's the trade-off though, Peter, right? Like ultimately to get lower inflation, the number one thing the government can do is to reduce that deficit spending,
that's
right?
right.
The
Yeah,
stimulus to me, number one, and obviously the increase in the money supply, number two, in terms of causing this inflation. And the reason inflation has come down is we did reduce the deficit off of the 2020 level, and we really pulled back on the money printing for the last few years. So, to the extent that they're going to reduce that deficit, yes, that could have an impact on inflation, but the trade off is going to be then we're going to have slower growth. And then instead of being angry about inflation, now you're
correct.
angry about potentially losing your job in a recession or something else. So, it's a very difficult trade off. And then you have the other side, as you said, that's benefited from this. They've been boosted by this inflationary policy of just lifting asset prices in terms of creating inflation. Yeah, it's not good if you're living paycheck to paycheck, but if you have assets that appreciate with inflation, then you're not going to try to fight against that trend so much. So it's a lot of competing interests, and as you said, it's very complicated. I don't think people fully understand or being told or being honest about either party about where it actually comes from and what they can actually do about it. Obviously, hopefully, inflation comes down, but you have to be careful what you wish for because if it comes down rapidly, it's likely going to be as a result of an economic contraction.
100% correct. And I think that I think that there is a difference between the way inflation impacts people with wealth and people without it. That people, there is a sacrifice to one to make things work for the other, to your point, and the policies are very conflicted. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the
Yeah.
inflation story really does play out.
Yeah, but no question, lower income people have been hurt by the policy of boosting inflation. It's the most regressive tax you can think of. So, yeah, my hope, as we'll talk about in the Fed section, is that we'll pursue policies for a stable inflation going forward. But let's touch on immigration here very briefly. I think the easy, low hanging fruit, Peter, if you look at polls across party, is just securing the border, reducing illegal immigration. I think that will likely happen here. I don't think that's a stretch to say. I think that was popular across both parties, and it's a big reason why he won those seven swing states. It just if it wasn't number one, it was number two after inflation in terms of it. But a lot of people are talking about legal immigration and they're worried about that end. And to that, I would say just look at the last 10 years and look at the period under Trump, there really wasn't a huge difference. We've been letting in about 1 million people per year. Legally, there wasn't a dramatic decline whatsoever the last time. If you listen to Trump and Vance and take them at their word, they seem to have no desire to reduce this. They're really focused on the illegal side, and the criminals that have come into the country, I think, would be number one in terms of trying to get them out of the country. Do you think there's people in terms of economics, people are talking about, well, what is this going to what's going to happen in terms of inflation with this or other things? It's very, very complicated to parse this all out in terms of is this good or is this bad? But I think you have to separate the two, illegal versus legal, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, so you've had about 1 million people coming in legally over the last, 10, 15 years, very little change across either party. you did hear in this election both parties talking about increasing legal immigration and both parties talking about stopping illegal immigration. And so that was really interesting to see them all match up here on this. But to the point on just economics. So the argument of the economic impact of illegal immigration is people that are coming in illegally largely are taking jobs that theoretically other Americans don't want, right? So I mean, there's a long list of them on farms and lots of other things. So is it inflationary to stop illegal immigration? And the answer to that, just the economic answer to it, is yes, right? Because if you don't have the illegal immigrants coming in and taking those jobs, then you've got to get Americans to take them. Now, some people say, well, no American will take them. That's 100% untrue. So, very simple economic supply and demand is if you increase the compensation, eventually someone will take it, right? So,
Yes.
let's
They
say
won't take
somebody
the American won't take it at the same wage as someone.
100% correct.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
if you are running a farm and you've got illegal immigrants doing something for $15 an hour and there's no longer illegal immigrants. Let's just say tomorrow they're not here. It's not going to happen, but just for the economic example. Then they've got to get their farm running, right? So they might have to pay $22 instead of $15 and then Americans will take them. At some point they will take them. Now, that means the cost of the stuff coming off that farm is going to be more. So, yes, illegal immigration drives prices down because it doesn't mean Americans have to the American business owner doesn't have to pay more for the American to do it. And so it would be inflationary to get rid of this. Now, the counter argument to that someone who's into enforcing the border would say, well, there are other costs. There are other costs to a society if we haven't screened people for all these reasons, or they're not coming through the normal process, or they put more pressure on social services. So it becomes a very muddled question. There is no question that an illegal immigrant drives down the labor cost, which is deflationary for what Americans will buy the goods for. There's also no question they're more likely to use social services, which puts more pressure on the economics. So it's a very, very muddled question. I think enforcing the border, if that's really what's going to happen here, is going to be mildly inflationary. But I don't really think on the campaign trail that's what this was about, right? I think on the campaign trail it was very much saying, hey, you've got legal immigrants that want to come to the United States. Why don't we let more legal immigrants come in than illegal immigrants? Why, and for it's a national security issue, why aren't we checking everything and all of that? I think that's when you look at the polls, Americans were more motivated by that, which is why, Trump said this was a big issue for him. And
Yeah.
Harris said she would run a different policy than Biden and more likely enforce the border because it really isn't. We're talking about the economics, but it really wasn't seen through an economic lens.
Yeah, it's a complex one. What I would say is if you look at working class communities and look at the way they voted and talked about this issue, they were talking about their wages not keeping pace with inflation, and this being another reason why, right? They're directly competing with people that they can't compete with because they have to pay taxes, right? They have to pay for healthcare. They have to pay the other things. And then they saw these people who aren't American citizens receiving these benefits. And so yes, theoretically perhaps it's inflationary, but it's kind of subsidizing big business and letting everyone else pick up the tab. So there's been different estimates. What is it actually costing in terms of those services, housing,
Yeah.
healthcare, education? And some people were talking about numbers. 150 billion was a number people threw out per year. So there's a cost to that as well. And of course, we're not taxing people to pay for that, Peter. We're borrowing, so we're increasing the deficit. So that side of it is inflationary, right? You're giving and just more people. Obviously, the housing market or rental market. If you have more people in the country and not building new housing units, it's inflationary in that sense, right? So it's very, very complicated. I think that the one thing most people would agree with is we're not we're a country, not just an economy, right? So if we were just an economy and you had that pure, view of let's just like you would have probably no border, but we want to know who's coming into this country. We want to theoretically have the address the needs. If we have a need in a certain area, we take more immigrants in that particular job or that particular skill set. It shouldn't be just randomly based on whoever can cross that border illegally is the one who wins that contest, right? I think so. I think most people kind of agree with that concept, and I think that's what'll happen. And I don't expect to see a big change on legal. Hopefully, they'll come up with a policy that benefits America as a whole, right? In terms of the stuff we've been talking about that forever, so I don't have high hopes on that, but that'll be the big change. And for people who in these lower income communities that haven't seen their wages keep up with inflation, I think reducing the number of illegal immigrants will actually help these people. And I think that was an issue for them. Okay, let's go to deregulation and energy here, Peter. This is obviously another big one in terms of Musk has talked about it a lot. Trump has talked about it. He did it early in his last administration. Kind of this idea that regulations continue to build and build and build. So I think they had this 2-for-1 rule the last time where if you're going to put in a new regulation, you have to remove two existing ones before you do that. And obviously, there's going to be things in terms of the EPA's powers, the fuel standards. People are expecting financial services to be deregulated. A lot of things going on here. What's your take in terms of regulations? Do you think we'll see a big shift here? And is this overall a good thing for the economy?
I think we're going to see a very big shift, and I think we already saw a shift with the Supreme Court. So you basically, we have these three parties of government that we're all aware of, right? And but over time, we developed all of these agencies that regulate different industries, and they create their own laws. We call them regulations instead of laws. And basically, the Supreme Court had a ruling a year or two ago that basically said, like, look, this has gotten carried away. Congress, the whole reason the Constitution, exists and created Congress is for Congress to pass laws. So there's just been too much power. These groups shouldn't be creating up rules as they go. So there's already this major trend that has nothing to do with Trump or Harris
Yeah.
moving towards a deregulatory environment. Now, Trump is very anti over regulation. So I think we're going to see a lot of movement here, where we're going to see much less ability for organizations to create rules on their own without Congress being involved or the executive branch being involved in any way. And I think this is a trend that's going to be very, very real.
Okay. Agreed. And I think ultimately that will be a good thing if your view is that there's too much regulation, reducing unnecessary or burdensome regulation will be good. And Peter, and as I think we've talked about in the past, for smaller businesses, this is a huge issue because the big corporations of the world, they love regulations,
Yeah.
right? Because it increases the barriers to entry. It's really the small players and new companies that are forming that have the most difficult time with this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like, every now and then, I just have somebody email me like, "Well, we should get rid of all regulations, and these are crazy." And that's obviously you don't want anyone to like inspect the food, your meat that shows up, or you don't want
Yeah,
there to be anyone overseeing safety of airplanes. Obviously, there needs to be regulation, and I view
yeah,
regulation the way I view traffic, stop signs, right? You want you don't want a stop sign every 5 feet. Would there be no accidents ever if there was a stop sign every 5 feet? That's true. But no one would ever get anywhere. There'd be no productivity. No one would ever get anything done. We'd all spend it. We want to have just enough stop signs and traffic lights to be safe and have a flow of traffic, but still be able to get where we want in a reasonable amount of time. That's like the art of regulation is
yeah.
have just enough to make sure the food you're eating is safe, the plane you're on is relatively all of those things, but not so much that the little guy can't get into business.
Yeah, Musk had a good analogy. He was talking about just a football game, right? You have refs on the field. You need to have them to enforce the rules. But let's say you had more referees on the field than players. Well, that would become a problem very quickly
Yeah.
for the for the game. Eventually, it would just stop the game, right? They would get in the way, right? So that's kind of the analogy. We'll see what happens there. Likely to be some changes for sure. Energy policy. I think there's been a lot of different proposals. I think we'll see reversion, just like Biden came in and reverses. I'm not a big fan of the executive orders, Peter. I would much prefer these things to be act of Congress, but that's unfortunately the world that we're living in. But immediately you're going to see these executive orders reversing what Biden did, which was reversing what Trump did, and just generally more in favor of obviously U.S. energy production. But and nuclear, I think, is a good discussion to have, and it's kind of a bipartisan thing. It's clean, a form of energy. The debate will be, can we do it in a safe way? But I think in terms of the recent research and evidence, it's pointing to we need to have more nuclear in this country. China's obviously doing it in a big way, and I think we should definitely focus on that as well. But I would just like to point out for people in terms of crude oil production, I think there's this perception that the president is going to make enormous changes. Like, we've been increasing crude oil production under Biden, under Obama, under Trump. Same thing with natural gas. It's going higher. Yes, Trump will be certainly more favorable in terms of giving federal leases and trying to just be more friendly in terms of creating domestic production. But it's not as if this all of this stopped during the Biden presidency. We are the largest now producer in the world of U.S. of oil and natural gas, and that's a very good thing for not only for our independence. Obviously, energy is a huge component of inflation, and the cheaper we can make energy, that's better off for everyone.
Yeah, I think that people don't realize they think we are importing all of our energy, we're creating it, and it keeps getting created no matter who's the president at a higher rate. So whether it's been Republican or Democratic administrations, these changes will be substantive, but on the fringe. To your point, I mean, it'll be more around federal leasing, more around maybe the way certain things are taxed, but this idea that we weren't producing, we're going to produce now, just not accurate.
Right. And if we talk about tariffs here, Peter, I want to get your take on here. But I'll just give you my quick view. I think all of this is just negotiating tactics. We saw a similar thing during Trump's first administration. He starts very high and then he comes in. But talking about these across the board tariffs of 10 to 20% and maybe 60% on Chinese imports, do you see any likelihood that would ever happen?
To me, I'm going to just use a totally different example to get into tariffs. Like
Okay.
some people, when you think about Walmart, some people think, well, was bad for America because it killed all the small businesses in all the small towns and came in, and then all the money goes to Walmart. But some people look at Walmart and go, well, Walmart's wonderful because only like 1% or 2% of the people in that town owned a small business, and everyone was paying more for the goods from that small business. Now they go to Walmart and they're paying 20%, 30% less. And so it's like a huge tax break for everyone in the town. Everyone's just paying less money to get the same stuff from Walmart. That to me is like, if you look at Walmart, Walmart's was deflationary, right? Everything costs less if you go to one big Walmart instead of 15 local businesses. So was it good for people because it lowered the cost of the average working American in a small town or a big city? Or was it bad because it put out some places out of business to do that? It depends on the lens you want to view it. And that's how I see tariffs. Like, if you look at an iPhone and some of the parts are coming from China, is iPhone making those parts in China because they love China and hate America? No, they're doing it because they're trying to make the iPhone for the lowest cost possible. And so if some of those parts can be made for less in China, they're going to make them in China, and you will pay less for the phone than if all those parts were made in America. So what Trump is saying is, well, I'm going to tax the parts that come from China at 60%. Well, guess what? That part is going to cost 60% more, and your phone is going to cost more. It's inflationary. We know that. So yeah, the American company that can make that same part is now going to sell it. But the reason Apple wasn't using them in the first place is they cost substantially more. So when you tax these things coming in, if we don't we either have to pay more for the product coming in, or that product doesn't come in and we pay more for the product being made in the United States. It's 100% inflationary. So if you're looking at this as a liberal, you go, well, this is a terrible policy. If you're looking at it as a conservative, the only way you can make any sense of it is, Charlie, the way you're saying it, which is that Trump isn't really serious about actually having tariffs. What he wants to do is convince the Chinese and other countries that he will impose this tariff and extract something in exchange for removing the tariff. So starting out with, hey, I'm going to tax stuff from China at 60% more and stuff coming from other places at 10 or 20% more, but then going to them and going, look, I'll forget about all of that, but you've got to let more American goods into your country.
Yep.
If he accomplishes that, then everybody in America wins. That's wonderful. If we really wind up in a world with tariffs, everybody loses. And so it's really the lens you want to view this in and where it's going.
Yeah, I think like in a theoretical economic sense, right? Tariffs are bad, but there are occasions where it makes sense. And then I'm not saying that's not then bad for everyone. It probably still is, but there's a difference between free trade and fair trade. And we know that China is not playing fairly on a lot of these things. They simply do not allow a whole host of American goods to be sold in their country. And so, what sense does it make not to impose tariffs on those same goods coming here? And also, Peter, we learned during COVID that there is a security risk and there's a risk to medications and other things. We couldn't get a lot of stuff because of the supply chain issues. So, perhaps there's certain industries national security risk that we should be thinking about that. But the transition to that, and I think Musk is very practical on this. He's talked, openly. Obviously, he deals with China with Tesla and others. You can't go overnight to imposing these tariffs because we don't have the means of production right now. If your goal is to have more American manufacturing and more independence, I think that's a fine goal, but you can't do that overnight because that would simply, as you said, be highly inflationary. We can't immediately start producing these goods. It will take some time.
Yeah, I mean, this if we get to a world where we threaten tariffs, and in exchange for not having tariffs, we get access to American companies to sell more things in China and other countries, there's a huge win for everybody in America because you will continue to pay the least amount possible for the goods coming to you that are manufactured across the globe to get the best pricing, and then the foreign other countries have their doors open to American business. If that's executed upon, that'll be great. Now we've tried this before under Trump. We got one of our two most recent bear markets when we went into this, and the market went down 20% very quickly, and it wound up being a negotiation. It didn't get very far. It'll be interesting to see what happens this go round.
Yeah, and I would just like to point out, because I mean, people are saying this is simply a Trump thing, and that somehow it's different. Well, if we look at the amount collected under Biden, it was actually more than Trump. He kept pretty much all of the Trump tariffs and then added a little bit more in terms of the. So uh, I think when it comes down to it, it plays well, and for good reason, Peter. If you look at the middle of his country and the hollowing out of the manufacturing base, that's real, right? In terms of the jobs that were lost, and they feel like they were sold out for these big businesses making deals with China, and the labor conditions there were terrible. We just said simply, oh, if we can have it cheaper, let's export it there. We won't protect these jobs, and so that was a big issue in 2016. I think it's still a big issue in many communities today. So you can't kind of discount that in terms of it's more complicated than simply, well, China can produce it cheaper, so we should, in terms of the free trade, we should produce here what we can produce cheaper, and they should do like that. Is the ideal. Everyone focuses on the goods that they can do the best, and then we trade. But when you have an absolute advantage and you have one country not respecting environmental laws or respecting labor laws and having child labor and other things, they haven't had an absolute advantage, and they use that obviously to just take millions of manufacturing jobs from the U.S.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt, and I think these companies are, companies don't care. Like, I mean, I don't think anyone wants to know where their Nike shoes are being made, right? Who's actually putting them together in these factories? It's not a level playing field. I think everyone has known that under both administrations. I think one of the things that you've talked about that I think is interesting is the deglobalization that has to happen because of COVID, and just which, regardless of tariffs, is something that has to happen. Like we used to make chips in Taiwan because they cost less, but Taiwan's at risk with China, and so what are we going to do if there's a crisis? We're going to lean on a country that won't sell to us in a crisis. We have to control that because that's part of national security. So now the United States is building chip plants in Arizona and trying to localize it. So we
Yep.
are going to pay more for that. We're seeing that deglobalization coming out outside of COVID. regardless of the tariff war, no matter what, more things are going to be made in America because, from a standpoint of national security, it just has to happen that way.
Yep. Okay. Do we have time for foreign
Let's keep
policy or
let's keep
wars?
going. Let's keep going.
Okay. All right. So very quickly here, I'm optimistic on this stuff, Peter, simply because uh, Trump has already spoken with Putin. Maybe there's a chance that the parties can get together and end that war. Maybe the Israel Hamas conflict can get. Is there some hope that these things are going to actually work out just based on the precedent of Trump during the first administration? Be willing to talk to anyone and just sit down and try to make a deal.
Boy, there's so much that goes into all of these wars and what the real agendas are behind them. But let's just, and the thing I'm least interested in these wars is the economic element. But look, that's what our job is here, is to talk about that component. If
Yep.
you just take the money that we've spent on these two major wars now, where it's U.S. weapons and U.S. tanks and U.S. planes and U.S. bullets being fought in these wars, if you just took the money that we've spent in the last couple of years in this war, you could have eliminated all homelessness, paid for everybody in America to have health care, and paid for everybody in America to go to school. All of those things, just with what we've paid in war support for these
Incredible.
wars. So it's economically insane. Now, people have their whole ideas about what these wars are really about and are they worth it and all of that stuff. Um, I am not. I do think Ukraine Russia is going to come to a conclusion, and I do think without a change, it would have just gone on. It would have just gone on. There was no end in sight. I do think there is an I want to say anti-war, but less interest in things that don't directly benefit the United States very directly. So I do think we might see a conclusion of the Ukraine-Russia war. Now, a lot of people would say that conclusion is very bad for the United States because it might be acquiescing land, and I don't want to get into all of that. But I think
Mhm.
economically, you would see less money flow there. I think you'll still have the same winners and losers overall in the Israel-Hamas conflict, but that it will reach a conclusion quicker in terms of the military component and the spending that goes with it. And I think China's going to negotiate, and I'm hopeful that they can negotiate with Iran and not wind up having another regional conflict. So we'll see. But who knows? Economically, though, obviously the two major issues are Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Hamas. These are a massive burden to the U.S. taxpayer. You can argue whether it's worth it or not, and I think that we'll
Yeah.
get to a point where the bullets stop flying pretty quickly here.
Yeah, it's a huge burden. I don't think it gets enough attention, as you said, the problems we have in this country and the money that's going there. And in terms of accountability and in terms of figuring out where all that money's going, well, hopefully we'll get some transparency on that and we'll actually say this is crazy and we shouldn't continue to be doing this. The big problem, I think, especially with Russia and Ukraine, well, any of these things, is the way I look at it, there's no real end in sight. There's no goal. There's no kind of saying, well, if this happens, it will end. So I think you have to just get the parties in a room and see what everyone will accept as a negotiation that satisfies everyone and stops people from being killed, stops Ukraine from being destroyed. Because as it stands now, it's not helping Ukraine, it's not helping Russia, and it's not helping the United States, who is funding this massive thing that most of American people have no idea. I think what's going on there. So I'm hopeful as well, and I do think that we'll see a resolution at some point next year with that conflict and with the other stuff. Hopefully, the principle, as you talked about, there's growing a component of, let's say, America first, and there was kind of a rejection, I think, as part of this election of the Dick Cheney wing, of neoconservative wing of the party. However you feel of it, there was a rejection of that. We don't want to have another Iraq on our hands where we're spending trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people are dying.
It's been fascinating to watch because this whole neoconservative movement really took hold in the Bush administration. Cheney,
Yep.
Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, all of those guys. So it's very much associated with the Republican Party. So to see the neoconservatives controlling foreign policy in a Democratic
I
party,
never
where
thought I would see that.
yeah, it's really to watch the Democrats argue for war, the Republicans anti-war. It's the Republicans argue anti-war. It's like a reverse. It's the Seinfeld's Bizarro world. The Bush
Yeah.
administration controlled by neocons. Obama held the neocons at bay. Biden, like, in love with the neocons. And so to watch Trump now be anti-neocon, just I think yesterday he announced Pompeo and Nikki Haley would not be
Yes.
part of his administration. These are two of the biggest, no matter how you feel about wars, these are two of the most pro-war people. Like, war is just a normal tool of foreign
Yeah.
policy, and to just flat out say they're not going to be in the administration signals that he wants these things to come to a conclusion.
Yeah. I think there can be a consensus here. I think the Bernie Sanders and there's the old Democratic, there's still people there that have that belief that it didn't move over, and maybe you can get a consensus enough to say let's try to find
Yeah,
a
you have
resolution.
AOC, Bernie Sanders.
Yep.
There's plenty of people on the Democratic side that are also
Yeah,
against
but
this
it
stuff.
is amazing, isn't it? And then that just goes back to why I feel like stop with the party stuff. Take each issue by itself because the parties, if you give them long enough time,
Yeah,
they're going to flip from one side to the other. Okay, let's quickly talk about the Fed here. Trump, obviously, I think a lot of this is just blustering, and he likes to just say what he says. And he did this during the last administration. Nothing really changed. He wants lower interest rates, I think, is in general the policy. But is he going to remove Powell? I doubt it. And Powell saying he's not going to leave even if he's asked to.
yeah,
But do you think that there's to me, the bigger issue with the Federal Reserve is there should be accountability. They're not beyond reproach, and I think both parties should want to have more control in terms of saying, should we let this body really get more and more powerful, which is what's gone on over the last 20 years. So if I had my way, I think Congress should start limiting their powers, saying you can't just unilaterally just print money and buy mortgage bonds, for example. You have to get our approval if you want to do that in the future. What do you think about something like that? Do you think that this is overblown in terms of this, or it's just the media likes this kind of conflict.
yeah.
It's fun
Powell's
and
not
it's
going anywhere.
interesting, but
Yeah, Powell's not going
I,
anywhere. Trump's not going to
yeah,
try to remove him. The Fed caused most of the problems we saw under that latter part of the Trump administration and throughout most of the Biden administration. Um, but I think we're finally at a place where we started the podcast where inflation is decelerating and somewhat under control. And I mean, what this is probably the mistakes have been made, and then we've gotten to as good a spot as we can possibly be right now. So I don't think this is high on his priority list. I don't think anything's happening here.
okay, yeah. Let's go to signal or noise here, Peter. I just want to run through what's happened quickly. The market was obviously booming before the election, and then it surged again. It's now going back to 1990, second best start to a year. Only 1995 was better. If we look at the all-time high list here, which we update every time, we're at 50 now. So only a small group of years have 50 all-time highs or more. We're already at 50. Obviously, we still have more to go. S&P 500 up 26%. Best start to a year since 1995, 11th best in history. And I just wanted to get your take on this chart because a lot of people are making a lot about these moves, and there have been some big moves in terms of what's happened since the election. Mostly just U.S. stocks continue to do what they did before, but some interesting things because you have small caps doing exactly what they did actually when Biden was elected 4 years ago, and then exactly what they did when Trump was elected in 2016, surging higher, hitting record highs. Obviously, bank stocks doing very well. The perception is it's going to be deregulation there. That's going to help them. And obviously, crypto going crazy and Tesla going up. But interesting on the other side, Peter, is to see gold being down. You have obviously dollars strength here. International stocks down. China down. Obviously, that's part of the tariff maybe perception here. What do you make of these moves? Should people read into them, or is it just way too soon? As we saw in 2016, what I would tell people is those initial moves,
Yeah.
they many of them were reversed a year later in terms of the outperformance and the underperformance. So what I'm saying is there was an overreaction immediately after the election back then, and perhaps that's what we're seeing again today.
Yeah, I think we're seeing like just a quick adjustment on the price. Like if you're a small company, regulation, as we talked about, hits you the hardest. You could expect a little bit less regulation. Makes sense. Your price goes up. Interest rates are dropping. You can expect a little bit less cost on your interest payments. So these things help small cap stocks. Banks expect less regulation. But to your point, which is why they would go up now. But to your point, these are short term moves. You can't get away from the long term macro trends. So let's take banking for a minute. Over the
Yeah.
long run, the government doesn't want to bail out banks anymore. What are they going to do? They're going to turn the banking industry into the utility companies. We're going to see their multiples continue to contract, their yield continue to. They're going to become not growth engines anymore. So yes, we're getting one-time adjustment, but it's hard to extrapolate over the very long run based on this.
Yeah, 100%. But it would be interesting. We talked about it a long time. Small caps finally start to have their day in the sun. Would be interesting. You
Yes.
and I did a show back in January, if you remember, Peter. Small caps were 20% below their high when the S&P 500 was hitting a record high. What we said is every time in history that that's happened, the gap wasn't closed with the S&P crashing. It was closed with small caps catching up. And look what they're doing here, hitting their first all-time high since November 2021. And perhaps we're going to see that change in terms of leadership going forward. And I want to end with this chart here and let you take this away. This is a chart showing you returns during each presidency, because we started this by saying a lot of people are concerned, and there's a lot of concerns from clients and worried about things. And like the temptation, of course, is when you have concerns, Peter, is to take action, right? I'm worried about the next 4 years. We talked about all of those different things that might happen. There's a lot of uncertainty there. So the temptation is, well, let me just get out of the market until there's more certainty on that. What would you say to those people? And what do you have to say to really set their minds at ease? And what is this chart really illustrating here overall, if you look at the last 100 years in the
The
US?
market's not blue. The market's not red. The market is green. It only cares about money. If you think things are going to cost more 4 years from now, 10 years from now, you should be an equity investor. Things have worked out under Obama, under Trump, under Biden, and will probably work out again this go round for equity investors. So if you own stocks and you're focused on the long run, ignore the chaos, ignore the noise, stay in the game. That's the only way to win.
Yeah, just keep politics out of your portfolio. You have these discussions. It's fun. You and I talked for the last hour talking about different things. We could probably talk for 3 hours and do a Rogan podcast at some point on these topics. But do all of that, but don't let that influence your portfolio. And by all means, ignore what the narrative and what the media is trying to sell you in terms of fear mongering and the rest of it. Like you said, during Obama, during Trump, during Biden, what we've seen is more progress in terms of earnings and stock prices going up. That doesn't mean stocks can't go down. There will be another term like we saw under Bush. Perhaps that will be the case this way, but there's no way of knowing that. And you shouldn't be playing for the next 4 years anyway. If you're an equity investor, you have to be looking much further than that. Okay. So if you're thinking about the election, thinking about your portfolio, before you hit that buy or sell button, reach out to us today at creativeplanning.com/Charlie. We're going to give you a free wealth path analysis. Get a second look on your portfolio. Make sure it addresses your goals and needs for the future. At Creative Planning, we're in all 50 states, so we likely have a location right near you. We're abroad as well. If you're international, reach out to us as well. $325 billion in assets under management and advisement, and we're here to help. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Signal or Noise election edition. Subscribe, like, leave a comment to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time on Signal or Noise.